Hello, everyone. I'm Rebecca Newell. Thank you so much for joining me. You're very, very welcome. I'm the head of art at the Imperial War Museums. So this evening, I'm going to take you through a bit of a whistle-stop tour of 10 works of art from the IWM's diverse and fascinating collection. First of all, I want to kind of set the scene a bit and give you a bit of background and context about the IWM and its collection more generally. So the collection comprises about 800,000 items collected by the museum since 1917. So we're quite an old collection. And we tell the story of modern war and conflict. Our remit then is to explore the causes, course, and consequence of war and conflict. So the collection covers the everyday to the sublime from all types of perspectives, those who fought, those who witnessed, those who have reflected and mediated our understanding and exploration of war. We cover overseas perspectives, home front experiences, and consider local, national, and international dimensions. The collection comprises exhibits of all type, the art collection, of course, photographs, film, a sound archive, vehicles, tanks, planes, and all kinds of large objects, technological objects. And indeed, our largest object is HMS Belfast itself, which you may know. We have 5 sites, including IWM North in Salford, IWM Duxford, Churchill War Rooms, HMS Belfast that I've already mentioned, and this site, which you can see in front of us, IWM London at Lambeth Road. And here you can see the exterior of the building as you approach it with the wonderful kind of springtime flowers. And it became the IWM in 1936. And before that time, it was the Bethlehem Royal Hospital, and you may know of that history slightly. So the collection includes a diverse and exceptional art collection, numbering in total about 100,000 items all told, with many great works of art from the war art schemes of the First and Second World Wars. And I think that's probably the area that people might think of if they know that IWM has an art collection at all. And in that sense, it's a world-class representation of British modernism. But IWM has continued to commission and collect works of art from all types of artists through the late 20th and into the 21st century, reflecting recent and contemporary conflicts, including Northern Ireland, the Falklands, Bosnia, Iraq, and Afghanistan, and we go on in that journey. So I'm going to take you through 10 diverse works of art from the collection, for which I'm responsible at IWM. And I'm going to start with perhaps my most iconic painting. If I can move the slide, there we go. Perhaps our most iconic work, which is John Singer Sargent's Gast. And this is a work you may know either through visiting or in reproduction. It's one of perhaps our most famous images. And it's also a very large painting, which measures over 6 meters in width. And it's a scene of the aftermath of a mustard gas attack on the Western Front in the First World War. And we see a line of soldiers here in the center being led along a duckboard by a medical orderly. And their eyes are bandaged from exposure to gas. And each man holds the man in front. So it's a scene of camaraderie and friendship and support on the Western Front as much as it's a medical scene. And I think that we can think about this both in kind of symbolic and allegoric terms, as well as in terms of authentic narrative storytelling, perhaps. And Singer Sargent witnessed such a scene in France while accompanied by the artist Henry Tonks in August of 1918. Mustard gas was widely used by this point of the war. It was an indiscriminate weapon causing widespread injury and burns, as well as the damage it inflicted on the eyes. And the painting gives clues about the management of the victims, their relative lack of protective clothing, the impact and extent of the gas attack, as well as its routine nature of use. And you can see just in the background, very far away in the background, a sense of things carrying on regardless, as we've got a football match playing out behind them. And Henry Tonks, who was with Singer Sargent, described the context of this work in a letter to the art writer Alfred Yochney in March 1920. And he said, and I quote, After tea, we heard that at Le Bac de Sous there was a good many Gast cases. So we went there. Gas cases kept coming in, led along in parties of about 6, just as Sargent had depicted them by an orderly. They sat or lay on the grass. There must have been several hundred, evidently suffering a great deal. Chiefly, I fancy, from their eyes, which were covered up by a piece of lint. Sargent was very struck by the scene and immediately made lots of notes. And then he kind of worked this painting up from that experience. I think we can also say that it probably didn't happen exactly like this, and that I certainly read into it this kind of frieze-like procession of these Stoic figures, and I think he's also thinking about the canon of art history behind him. Sargent had been commissioned by the government as part of a war artist scheme during these late war years to contribute the central painting to a hall of remembrance that was never realised, actually. As an American, the government had given him the kind of thematic heading of Anglo-American cooperation, but he struggled to find a suitable subject matter and eventually chose this scene instead. Sargent had led a very privileged life and a rather nomadic one, and actually had been travelling in the early years of the war, and particularly spent quite a few months in America. And so therefore he'd remained fairly cut off from the realities of what others were experiencing. And I think we understand now that he probably didn't know what he was walking into in taking this commission on, and that he was both confused and deeply troubled by his war experiences and by what he witnessed. And he wrote that the most dramatic the situation, the more it becomes an empty landscape. The Ministry of Information expects an epic, and how can one do an epic without masses of men? And I think that gives a sense of his kind of anxiety and worry about producing the commission. And then on to another kind of approximate in time work of art from the collection. This is Anna Ayres' Shellforge. And Anna Ayres, who isn't very well known today, but she was one of the first female war artists employed by the munitions subcommittee of the newly founded Imperial War Museum in 1918. And she was at the time, one of the most well-known and successful artists, particularly female artists of her generation. But the committee imposed strict and inequitable terms on her contract of employment when compared with her male counterparts, including their right to refuse a work and leave Anna Ayres without payment. She painted from life and completed 4 large paintings, actually, of munitions factories for her commission, and she satisfied the committee, and they did pay up. Alongside this scene in Hackney, she completed paintings of aircraft manufacturing in Hendon, women working in a gas retort house, and of the Singer sewing factory in Glasgow, which had been converted to armaments manufacture. And I think they kind of match in terms of scale and ambition. The 4 works really come together in this way, and I think they explore a new frontier for women's work during the war, and also provide a kind of gently critical eye on British industry that was at the time being held up as kind of exemplary and really leading in the war effort. And actually she exposes it to be a rather frenzied, rather chaotic, dangerous and fragile structure. And she described capturing this specific scene at Hackney as the most taxing, since it demanded she work with great speed to capture the colour of the molten metal. And I think we can see from this reproduction how luminous that painting and those passages of painting are, but actually in life they absolutely glow. The factory interior was ferociously hot as well as treacherous. Batches of red hot shells would be put on the ground to cool, and you can see that happening in the scene. And she described the shells rolling towards her feet as she worked. And on one occasion, she wrote that the floor became so hot that her shoes were burnt off her feet. And I'm able to quote from the artist's kind of correspondence and thinking, because IWM very fortunately holds the War Artists Archive, which reveals the kind of day-to-day running of the war art schemes and gives a really fascinating insight into the artist's experiences through the insight of their many forms of correspondence and form filling that they had to do. And now on to another preeminent First World War artist. This is Stanley Spencer's Travois Arriving with Wounded from 1916, and he painted it up in 1919. Stanley Spencer, coming from a slightly different place, he was a really up-and-coming artist at the outbreak of war, and was part of a really important, distinctive single-year cohort at the Slade. And this particular year was studying under Henry Tonks, who I've already mentioned, and his kind of the intake of that year included Christopher Nevinson, Paul Nash, Dora Carrington, David Bomberg, and others. So a really fascinating group, which Tonks described as a crisis of brilliance. And I think this speaks to the years before the First World War that were demanding and exciting in terms of art history and various forms of modernism, including Futurism, Cubism, Fauvism, Expressionism, were kind of competing for dominance at this time. And we can see lots of the beginnings or the kind of intellectual struggles of the artist with these ideas in the IWM collection. By all accounts, Spencer was a very spirited individual, quite eccentric, eager to do his bit at Outbreak too, kind of urgent for some action. And following two brothers who had immediately joined up at Outbreak, he was posted to the Salonika front in an area of northern Greece and Macedonia, and largely undertook medical duties, at first in the Royal Army Medical Corps. And lots of his work has a kind of medical flavour, lots of his wartime output. And when he arrived, he was stationed with an ambulance unit and soon dealt with the aftermath of an attack in which, he said, the wounded passed through the dressing station in a never-ending stream. In 1918, so at the end of the war, he was commissioned under the War Artist Scheme to make a work of a theme on a religious service at the front. And again, thinking through his experiences, he returned to this real life experience of dealing with the aftermath. And I think a very notable feature of Spencer's work, and this work perhaps in particular, is a kind of spiritualism. And he found this kind of spiritualism in his battlefield experiences, and then imbued his work with it, partly because of his fervent, if unconventional, form of Christianity. And you may know that post-war, Stanley Spencer went on to make a cycle of related paintings at Sandham Memorial Chapel, which you can still see and visit, which have been described as a process of remembrance and exorcism for Spencer after the war, and which was a truly colossal undertaking, which took, I think, near on 6 years. And I think in this painting, we can feel some of that early exploration of some things that we then see at Sandham. Spencer wrote of his aim to, and I quote, show God in the bare, real things, in a limber wagon, in ravines, in fouling mule lines. And this scene of casualties being drawn on sledges, or travois, as they're called in the technical term, towards this kind of central dressing station in a converted old church in the small village of Smol, is absolutely imbued with this sense of veneration. And you might be thinking that it's reminiscent of kind of nativity scenes, perhaps, or other sorts of religious experiences within a kind of grand narrative painting setting, and I would agree. So now moving about 20 years in time, another kind of big iconic image of the IWM collection is this, Paul Nash's Battle of Britain, made in 1941. Nash was a very well-known artist, one of two brothers who had really cut their teeth as war artists in the First World War. This is obviously a Second World War period. And by this period, Paul Nash is a very well-known artist. He was part of that luminous Slade year that we've already talked about, and had become a very important modernist in the kind of interwar years. He was a firm believer in the role of artists in a war effort, in a wartime propaganda setting, and in terms of boosting morale. He thought that artists had a really key role to play. So he remained a good choice for the kind of War Artists Commissioners by this point during the Second World War. Like many others, Nash was explicitly and steadfastly revulsed by Nazism and its culture. And in this image of modern warfare, he presents a vision of British RAF fighters in their defeat of the German Luftwaffe. And I think we can feel that he's presenting alongside that a sort of sense of triumph of universal good over bad. Defences seem to kind of rise up out of the English landscape to meet the machines of fascism. The painting in this way supports that sort of sense of his idea of what artists could be in a wartime context, and is a sort of restatement of the value of art in helping to defeat the enemy. And therefore, it's also a painting about modernism's fundamental intellectual, emotional, and cultural rectitude and power. Nash produced this painting very close to the Battle of Britain event, and the painting encapsulates its scale and importance as a kind of aerial campaign in Britain at the time. We can see, in terms of the literal elements of the painting, we can see RAF fighters sweeping along the English Channel to break up advancing aerial formations in a summer sky filled with vapour trails, parachutes, balloons, cloud. And Nash was absolutely fascinated by these elements, and we see them again and again in his work. He also preferred symbolism and allegory to literal depiction. So that's what we have here. We have an imaginative summary of the event. He returned often to airplanes, actually. He was absolutely fascinated by this kind of conflation of illusion and symbolism that that kind of air technology brought, but also the realities of what was going on. In 1942, he wrote an article for Vogue called "The Personality of Planes," describing his anthropomorphic view of these, quote, beautiful monsters and their potential power. And it's likely that actually he never flew, probably. So they remained this kind of this intellectual exercise, I suppose, thinking about these planes. He was very severely asthmatic and had quite a bout of ill health during this period. So it's likely he didn't ever go up in a plane. And I thought I'd show you another Second World War work by contrast, and this is Laura Knight's The Nuremberg Trial of 1946, a very different kind of work from the Second World War period. Laura Knight, a very well-known, well-respected artist during the Second World War, and she was appointed as a war correspondent, making a special BBC broadcast. Actually, she was kind of given this kind of dual role to be an actual correspondent, a kind of journalist correspondent, as well as a war artist. And she made that speech on the BBC from Nuremberg. She gained special access, as many war artists and court artists, I suppose, do, to a courtroom box above the prisoners, and that's essentially the vantage point we have here in the painting. So we're in the Nuremberg Palace of Justice, and she made lots and lots of charcoal studies of the main protagonists. Actually, quite an unusual thing. You may know that often court artists are kind of actually prohibited from making drawings in situ, but she gained access to that. And here, what we literally have is the accused Nazi leaders in various modes of attentiveness, we could say, or kind of boredom, even despair, in places, headed up by a white-suited Hermann Goering, and you can see him kind of in essentially the kind of upper middle section of the painting in white. And we have these kind of prisoners stretching away from the foreground into the centre of the painting, and they're attended by lawyers who are in the black robes. Many across the scene wear headphones necessary to hear a translation of the court proceedings. And then behind the defendant stands a line of military police in white helmets who guard the benches and separate them from the court beyond. For context, 21 Nazi leaders were tried at Nuremberg, including the architects of the notorious death camps. 11 were sentenced to death, 3 to life imprisonment. So that just gives you a sense of, the seriousness of the proceedings that were going on. Knight obviously felt that she was there under the special kind of privilege of being a kind of documentarian in a way, and she was very concerned about kind of creating a faithful rendering of what she was seeing, but she moved some of the main protagonists around for reasons we can't really access. Goering is pictured where he sat. We know he was there from the photographs. Hans Frank, who was Hitler's personal lawyer and governor of occupied Poland, was in life seated on that front row, like Goering. But Knight moved him to the end of the second row, closest to us. So you see him in the bottom, the very bottom right-hand corner with his hand raised. And perhaps the hands gives us a clue as to why Laura Knight moved him. He wore gloves each day to court, but she degloved him in her image. And the raised hands bears the scar of a failed suicide attempt. So perhaps that was something that she was thinking about. It's also most likely deliberate, I think, that no women are present in the scene. So all we have is the eye of the female painter, and that must be, I think, that must be intentional. But I think as well, she's very conscious about that kind of faithful recreation of how the trial felt. And I think that's the very special role that art plays in the IWM collection, particularly art of this kind that's about, you know, momentous seismic historical episodes. Knight was deeply disturbed by what she heard during the trial. And in addition, she added this imaginary landscape that we see floating at the top of the painting. And that was a later decision as she moved through the work. And I think with this, we are invited to contemplate the dreadful consequences of totalitarian power, contrasting with this kind of documentary representation of the courtroom underneath. We have this more intangible sense of horror, damage, desolation, and I think she's kind of giving us both kinds of representation. And as I say, I think there's something very, very special about works in the collection which deal with atrocity and horror of war. And artists occupy this very special position because they ask us not just to look, but to look carefully and to actually see and absorb what's in front of us. And I wanted to give you a kind of a different example, I suppose, of that kind of work that deals with, you know, very challenging, atrocious subjects. This is Peterhausen's Cleansed, made in 1994. Peterhausen was commissioned as an official war artist for the Bosnian War by the museum, and was sent to Bosnia and Herzegovina to record the work of the United Nations peacekeeping forces. Hausen later said and meditated over his experience and said that the horrors that he had seen had risked his sanity. He worked this painting up and a series of others back in his studio in Glasgow, reflecting mainly on the atrocities that he'd witnessed. So for some context, in '92, Bosnia and Herzegovina declared independence from Yugoslavia following the succession of Slovenia and Croatia in 1991. This exacerbated already existing tensions between Bosnians, Croatians and Serbians, which then sparked the war. And I think now, perhaps more clearly than then, we know that the perpetration of war crimes, including forced expulsion, brutalization and sexual brutalization and murder of certain groups as part of an ethnic cleansing campaign, defined the conflict and has defined the conflict since its legacy as well. So in this close-up view, Hausen represents a group of Bosnian Muslim refugees who he had met and who he had seen, who were forced at gunpoint from their homes by militant Croatians. He depicts them sitting by the side of the road outside a village in Bosnia, hands outstretched, kind of looking for help, looking for solace. And they're waiting for their belongings next to a UN camp in which they had been hoping to seek refuge, but which they had been denied entry to. Hausen, as is true with many of his works and also this series, distorts the figures, enlarging and elongating their bodies. And I think that this might help us to recall kind of exaggerated forms that we see in Northern European crucifixion painting, but here we have a kind of lack of salvation and redemption. And we have other works that take a completely different stance. This photograph is from a series after wars and was taken in Sarajevo by artist Ayres Gast in the aftermath of the Bosnian War. And he takes as his subject kind of the cityscape in and around the city, a series of landscapes and apartments that bear the scars of war, but also act as a kind of locus for recovery. We see the swimming pool crowded with bathers and spectators, and on close inspection, we can see pockmarks of fighting on the concrete wall above. The series of images by Ayres Gast are not moralistic. This is not an artist grieving the past. It's not about the devastation or atrocious deeds. They also don't commemorate a kind of lost Bosnia. This is about, instead, capturing an immutable kind of force of life that conditions us and generates optimism and renewal in a kind of post-conflict environment, or in any place really. And I think his images force us to kind of consider that othering that takes place within a kind of conflict cultural spectatorship, which tends to separate war zones into before and after, rather than through a kind of lens of continuum, which I think he's trying to point to here. And I want to kind of give us another work that brought us more up to date here. And this is Peter Kalkhoff's Stealth from '95. Again, a large painting. This is based on a Nighthawk stealth bomber, which was the first operational stealth aircraft and was used in the Gulf War of 1990 to 91. Developed to be hard to see or detect using radar, their development remained very secretive, but also enabled the more exact execution of direct strikes over Iraq during the war. So Peter Kalkhoff, who was German but London-based, was interested in the geometry and form of the aircraft. I think we can see how much it speaks to his kind of sustained investigation into colour, shape, space, making grids, making lines, creating shapes, which we see again and again in his work. Stealth is actually amongst his most figurative works, I think because he's actually wanting to literally, to some extent, describe his concern between, his concern with the tension between the kind of sense of human creativity that we see in this work and the invention of tools of destruction in war. And he's trying to kind of create this particular image and icon to help us think about that. So we see this shape that's made up of shapes, and behind the shape of the bomber we see an earthy desert landscape covered by a grid, and ahead of it we see this colour coming through again, covered by a set of shining foil particles. The foil particles refer to radar and the failure of radar in this space, but also might refer to, I think, a kind of the scatter of stars and galaxies, which Peter Kalkhoff was also very interested in, kind of that universal tension between order and chaos in the kind of seemingly random nature of space. And it's this tension between ideas or elements that I think this work completely pivots on. Painted black and grey shapes create the body of the aircraft, but we can still see through it. So that's a tension there. His layers and textures point to this kind of duality of making, the duality of order and chaos, the duality of seeing and not seeing, the duality of presence and absence, the bomber that is both there and also not there. And I think that set of dualities is central to his exploration of an artist trying to represent three-dimensional space on a flat canvas. And it's also about a stealth bomber, which is a huge machine of war, but designed to be unobservable. And I thought I'd make this parallel, which is a much more contemporary work, 2013, by artist Marwish Chisholm, by the moonlight. And here we have a Reaper drone silhouette made with miniature gouache painted doves and folk patterns hovering over a Lahore landscape, which has been made using photo transfer. The artist tea-stained the ground for this work, and that, along with its kind of three-dimensionality, offers a way to question or even reject normal modes of viewing. She says, there are very distinct contrasting features of my work, colourful and bright symbols that are influenced by Pakistani folk art, truck art, jingle art, and then unmanned aerial vehicles, also known as drones. The physical presence of drones in the region contrasts with the visual absence of these deadly machines in the media. So she brings to the fore this strange and unsettling combination of contemporary violence with intricate, colourful, ornate, artistic, traditional making. And in this way, I think she's considering that kind of sinister and seeping way in which drones shape the physical, psychological, and cultural environment of Pakistan's border region. It's about the strangeness of conflict, the close-up experience of war on the doorstep, and the absence of representation in the media. And also about kind of disembodied contemporary conflict experiences. We have the visceral materiality of the brightly coloured, tea-stained, very kind of present work, and then the abstraction and distance of this kind of imagined icon. And in that way, it kind of offers up a question about the long-term presence of drones or absence of drones within our visual understanding. And I thought I'd finish off just with another kind of contemporary work from our collection. This is Paul C Wright's Mounds. IWM commissioned Paul C Wright in 2002 to respond to the war in Afghanistan, which had started the previous October. He was interested in how an artist might engage with conflict in a way that was different to the dramatic spectacles of photojournalism. So also thinking about himself in relation to that canon of media images, just as Chisholm had done. And he produced a series of photographs called Hidden, from which this work comes. Focusing on minefields and battle sites, the series acted as the artist's acknowledgement that almost everything in the conflict was hidden or unseen or invisible. About the work, he said that he had always been fascinated by the invisible, the unseen, the subject matter that doesn't easily present itself to the camera. And I think that's what's absolutely critical about artist engagement with IWM and our subject matter. In this image, the violence is defined, we know it's there, we're waiting for it, anticipating it, and we remain in suspense. The empty minefield becomes a kind of distillation of this lingering threat and menace, but it's also completely inaccessible to us. And at the same time, it gives us a kind of calm, alternative, peopleless view of a conflict that we think we've come to know through a specific type of image and reportage in the media. And C Wright's work highlights that kind of changing nature of contemporary warfare with its emphasis on remote technologies and hidden enemies. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you everyone for coming along and being part of this evening. I hope it's been revealing and enjoyable. I'd like to extend a huge thank you to Art Fund, Art UK and Bloomberg Philanthropies for bringing the works into the collection in the Art Fund's case, and also bringing this series together and inviting me to be part of it. Please do come and visit IWM at one of our branches. We'd love to welcome you. And there's so much more besides to see across our branches. So hope to see you there in the not too distant future, and thank you so much.